A black sheep is, by definition, a member of a family or group who is regarded as a disgrace to it. FromSoftware has a prolific catalog of games, some of them being considered so legendary that it fundamentally helped define the standard of what games of that genre should be, as well as entirely reinventing others. They have some heavy hitters under their belt, and every single one of their games receive their fair share of praise and respect. You hear a lot about Dark Souls 1, the game that originally was a spin-off of Demon Souls, but it was so good in and of itself that the spin-off became the status quo. And you hear about how refined and near perfection Dark Souls 3 is, with its dialing in on the Dark Souls formula. Sekiro and Bloodborne, highly regarded for their fantastic, groundbreaking combat systems, and Elden Ring almost redefining what it means to be an open-world game. But the one you don't hear as much or nearly as frequently in a positive way is Dark Souls 2. In a lot of ways, Dark Souls 2 is the black sheep of the Souls series, and before anyone gets too defensive about it, personally, I really like Dark Souls 2 for the most part. Compared to many other action or RPG games at large, it's a mile ahead of anything else still, but compared specifically to its 1 and 3 counterparts, it's a seriously flawed game with some unfortunate circumstances behind it. But for anyone who has played this game, you've most certainly run into a lot of the major holes and shortcomings that DS2 has. And for those of you who have never played Dark Souls 2, well, you're about to find out why it's considered the black sheep of the family. I even pondered that very question a lot myself. I mean, my first ever Souls game was Dark Souls 3, and sometime later on, I played a little bit of DS2 with a friend of mine, but really just remembering not liking it a whole lot and moving on and kind of forgetting about it. But for the longest time, it was never clear to me just why Dark Souls 2 is considered to be so bad by a lot of people. Surely it couldn't be that much different to Dark Souls 1 or 3, right? And so my journey began. I was determined to finish everything that Dark Souls 2 was going to throw at me, no matter what the obstacles were. And oh boy, I ran into some problems. I need to drink alcohol now. This was the first Souls game that I considered not even finishing. Not because it was too hard exactly, but simply because it just wasn't as much fun to play in some aspects. As I went through the beginnings of my Dark Souls 2 journey all the way to the very end, I paid really sharp attention to all the things that made up the game, and it started to dawn on me very quickly why this game just isn't on the same level as its older and younger brother. And so when I finally completed Dark Souls 2, I was left with a somewhat satisfied but hollow feeling at the same time. The victory I had over completing the game didn't feel nearly as sweet as beating literally any other FromSoft game, anything in their catalog. So it was my mission to get to the bottom of it and understand why that was, and more specifically, what went wrong with Dark Souls 2. So before we can get into the nitty-gritty of Dark Souls 2 in terms of its combat, level design, bosses, structure, all that stuff, we first need a quick history lesson. Hidetaka Miyazaki is the game director for Dark Souls 1, 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring, but not Dark Souls 2. This is important because him and nearly all of the other crucially important staff for DS1 were not present for the production of Dark Souls 2. Miyazaki and most of the high-level art guys and programmers and designers were actually starting development on Bloodborne shortly after Dark Souls 1, leaving the creative control in the hands of Tomohiro Shibuya. After that, sometime in the middle of Dark Souls 2's development, Tomohiro would step away and the project would be completely rearranged by Yui Tanemura, who would then become the new creative director. Now, some of you might be asking, okay, well, Miyazaki's name is credited for being a supervisor. How did all of this happen? Was he still not involved? From what we understand, he was more or less just tagged onto this project, but had almost no input or say in the direction. Dark Souls 2 is the one that Miyazaki had the least to do with creatively, and on top of that, the game being reinvented halfway through production made things even worse. They even say, this game actually went through quite a troubled development process. Due to a number of factors, we were actually forced to rethink the entire game midway into development. We had to decide what to do with the designs and maps that had been created up to that point. Ideally, we'd start again from scratch, but of course we were under time constraints, so instead, we had to figure out how to repurpose these designs into our newly imagined game. This meant everything from deciding the new roles for characters to finding ways to slot locations into the world map. map. Basically, everything had to be rearranged at the last minute, which is why everything is so cobbled together and disconnected. But this entire statement alone is very enlightening and eye-opening in terms of the toll that all of the trouble had on the final product of Dark Souls 2. Perfect example, and those of you who have played, you'll know that DS2 is an exceptionally long game, much longer than DS1 and even 3, and even Bloodborne. It's got a ton more bosses and areas too, and you might say, you know, what's the problem with that? That's kind of awesome, you know, it's more content. But the thing is, Dark Souls 2 really suffers from a quantity over quality problem. In fact, it has 3 separate DLCs as well, when its brothers only had about 1 or 2. And the main problem with this bloated amount of content is the fact that it's significantly less polished. It's a little more repetitive, and it overstays its welcome after a little while. Sure, you can take the approach that bigger is better and more is always preferred, but I also think there's something to be said for refining your game and cutting out all of the unnecessary fat to really fine-tune and perfect the stuff that's actually working. But ultimately, whatever the case may be, you get the vibe that the B team at FromSoft was primarily responsible for DS2's creation, and then the actual people behind Dark Souls 1's success were actually busy working on Bloodborne while DS2 was in production. In interviews, they talk about how sprawling and vast of a game Dark Souls 2 is, and I guess they're not wrong, but again, that's not really something to be proud of in and of itself. Besides, you know, retooling nearly the entire game midway through, it gets even more confusing because Dark Souls 2 has an original edition and then Scholar of the First Sin, which FromSoft considers Scholar to be the definitive and complete edition of DS2, the canon build of the game, if you will. So this was all to set the stage for what's next. It's good to have some background context on how internally conflicted and sloppy the execution of the development of Dark Souls 2 really was, and it's most definitely reflective in the game's choices, quality, polish, and design. Best way to put it, it's the Dark Souls game that has no idea what made Dark Souls work in the first place. However, even with that being said, I still do enjoy many aspects of DS2, which we'll cover, and I'll point out anything I do feel is excellent along the way. But after all of this, you should have a really clear understanding of why Dark Souls 2 doesn't get the same wide praise and love as its siblings do. Regardless of your personal feelings on it, it is objectively not as well done as those games. When I started up DS2 for the first time, the intro completely put me off. DS1 and DS3 have very similar openings in terms of how it briefly sets up the world and the powers within it and some of the enemies you'll be facing. Great, that's like literally all you need. In DS2, you get this weird feeling that this cutscene was not done in-house. It feels like a separate studio who has really no idea what Dark Souls is and how it's created. The game starts and you get some bullshit about the being a human and losing memories, but more importantly, the tone and attitude of the Firekeepers are literally taunting you, saying stuff like, you're gonna die a lot. And they may as well have flat out said, hey, you know, this game's gonna be really hard because it's Dark Souls and you're definitely gonna die more than a few times and you're gonna need to end up looking up stuff online and all. But here's where they're missing the point. Dark Souls never rubbed it in your face that the game was going to be hard on you. The difficulty was simply a byproduct of learning lessons. The difficulty in DS2 is mostly artificially placed and manipulated so they can say, hey, look how hard Dark Souls is. Isn't Dark Souls such a hard game? Yo, man, this Dark Souls game sure is hard, isn't it? Dark Souls is really hard, huh? It's just missing the point entirely and attempting to be deliberately difficult to a point of unfairness purely for the sake of annoying the player. I'm not saying that the other games are perfect here either, but usually I feel like the difficulty was a byproduct of learning. Again, not always, but most of the time. Or it was meant to teach you a lesson. Best example is the skeletons in the catacombs of Dark Souls 1. These are a brutally challenging enemy for any first new players arriving at Firelink. Yes, they're insanely hard and unfair, but the lesson is, hey, don't come here yet, go explore for a bit, and then perhaps try again later. Almost every Dark Souls is doing something seemingly unfair like this, but it's done because it's meant to teach you something or convey a lesson. But like, what the f is the lesson supposed to be here? I don't know, that we can spam mobs and enemies just because we can? What lesson does that teach me? That you can kill them enough where they despawn? But what do I get out of that other than just wasting my time? There's so many examples of DS2 clearly just missing the mark on what it means to be hard but fair, challenging but rewarding, grueling yet gratifying. Later on, they even get into the realm of borderline experimental game design, and not in a good way.
So
But that's all to say, just in terms of its tone, atmosphere, and attitude, it seems like it's a little off base, or it's just like this generic copycat studio who's trying to recreate Dark Souls. More so, contributing to the game's generic and clunky foreign feel is its controls and movement, and my god, they're so bad. You can tell right away when playing that something is off about how the controls feel. Unless DS2 was your first Souls game and this is just what you were started with, you can tell that something is a little strange. It's a bit less responsive, and it's kind of clunky without even being able to pinpoint exactly why. But if you are curious, without getting too caught in the weeds of technicality, DS1, for example, uses a full 360-degree motion input on your analog when controlling your character, when Dark Souls 2 uses square dead zones and snap points for control. And what this means for the everyday player is that your motion and movement are going to end up feeling weirdly linear and lack that precise control compared to what it used to be. Why they decided on using this movement and control system, I literally could not even begin to tell you. We all know it's one of the main components that contributed to Dark Souls 2's like clunkiness and off-putting feel, but this becomes especially a problem when you take into account how precise combat encounters have to be and how delicate positioning can be as well, and more so, the level design does not complement this more linear snap point system that they have implemented. Now, I guess there are mods that like change the snap points and make it a full 360-degree control and, you know, without the square dead zones, but I've never played it, but I'm just going to go ahead and assume that it would go a long way in making this game feel so much better and responsive to the player. But you'd be sadly wrong in assuming that the biggest issues of movement are just refined to this specific problem. The core defensive feature in Dark Souls, rolling, has been strangely reworked and reprogrammed. In Dark Souls, you can roll, and depending on how much gear you're carrying will determine how fast or slow that roll is, and the more nimble rolls generally have more frames in which you're intangible and invincible to all attacks, giving you what are called iframes. Generally speaking, this can be very advantageous to have a lighter roll because you have theoretically more time in which you spend invincible. In Dark Souls 2, your roll motion is determined by your equipment load, that's all the same, but your iframes are tethered to a totally different and arbitrary stat called ADP. This is an upgradable stat category that does so many different obscure things that the Dark Souls community still hasn't quite come to a complete understanding of. But basically, ADP for the most part directly affects the amount of iframes your roll has, as well as some other stuff. But one of the worst things this game did is tie such a fundamental game mechanic to a completely opaque and arbitrary stat in the game. Like, look at the damn description of the stat. Like what? This doesn't convey anything at all of the sort and can potentially be a devastating disadvantage if you didn't know about this beforehand. Also, the base healing Estus animation is so damn slow, and it's slowed down because it can be theoretically sped up by speccing into ADP, and like the Estus time is just painfully sluggish. This broken down stat hurts so many different base layer mechanics of the game, it's actually incredible. But it gets even worse. On top of all of that, there's seemingly small changes but completely break the rhythm of Dark Souls combat. That is the stamina recharge delay, and this refers to the lag between draining stamina and then the downtime that it takes before it begins recharging or that you can input something again. This means that in a lot of cases, you can't use the rest of your stamina to get a hit in and then respond with the correct defensive option like you can in basically every other game. It doesn't come back quite fast enough for the pace of gameplay like you should be able to, and it just means that you have to trade hits sometimes when you should be able to react to said move. Like, it just makes the combat feel weirdly unfinished and unresponsive, and it halts the rhythm of combat where you can get those nice flow states going, you know exactly what I'm talking about, but instead it just forces you to take hits sometimes and go back to neutral or straight up putting you in a disadvantaged situation. It's just not good. Now, in my opinion, one of the worst and most baffling choices Dark Souls 2 made was its insistence on having multiple types of healing options. Instead of Estus being your go-to and basically your only means of getting HP back, starting with a few and then kindling the fire for challenging areas and stuff, you have Estus and can increase the power and charges through Sublime Bone Dust and Estus Shards respectively. In Dark Souls 2, you have Estus, but it also has these life gems that not only heal you over time, but are also almost infinitely attainable. You can move more quickly while using them, and they end up totally breaking much of the level design and combat encounters. In fact, I personally think Dark Souls 2 plays much better when you avoid having an overabundance of life gems, or, you just don't purchase any, or just using spare ones that you may have come across time to time in the world design. Having upwards of 70 to 80 life gems at once, plus Estus, means that you're basically unkillable in the traditional sense, which is why they probably felt the need to have much more obnoxious level design to counteract this. I don't know, I just think that making healing this infinitely stackable resource completely breaks the delicate nature of the risk to reward ratio that feels so good in Dark Souls levels in this context, and turns it into a complete joke. That on top of the human effigy system. I don't like its concept or its execution. At worst, I think it goes against the very thing that makes Dark Souls so good, which is the learning process that never gets punished beyond what is reasonable. You lose all your souls, and that's pretty brutal, but that's about it. In DS2, each subsequent death means that you come back with even less health, thus making bosses and enemies in areas more difficult to learn and traverse. You get exponentially punished for trying to learn stuff, which to me is so entirely backwards. Like in Dark Souls 3, when you're embered, you get a bonus on top of your normal health, and that lasts until you die. It's rewarding of smart play and streaking rather than anything else, but you don't get even more hard punished for simply interacting with the game. But to make matters even worse, you are also more likely to get invaded when you're hollow, further punishing players that are already having a hard time or struggling. To me, it's just such contradictory game design. I also understand there's a ring to help this where it kind of limits the amount of HP reduction you can have, but still, I think you understand my point. If you're just meant to use the ring, then why even have this system at all then? Just make that like the base health mechanic. But it's just so goofy and kind of like scuffed. I just fundamentally don't agree with further punishing a player who's maybe trying a boss or an area over and over again to adapt and learn, but it doesn't matter because life gems make the system totally pointless anyways. But going back to the opening cutscene of Dark Souls 2, like we all know how the introductory levels of DS1 and 3 end up playing. They're a really small, like compact section with a few lessons to learn, base mechanics, and then a boss fight to thrust you into the gameplay loop. Dark Souls 1 probably has like the best intro in the series. DS2 opens with you awkwardly walking to the Firekeeper's house, going inside to then make your character, and then you kind of fumble around this area, and it also introduces you to the torch mechanic, which I understand the point of this, but it felt like a cheap way to add difficulty as an excuse for them to have dark levels or, things just to kill you. And I'm personally never a fan of overly dark levels in video games, period, but torches are a key in doing many things in the game, including accessing bosses, but it's not really conveyed super well in this portion of the game. But in reality, you can skip this area and go straight to Majula, but you can tell it's just not that really well done intro experience, and something just feels off. Like there's not even a tutorial boss that, basically gives you a flavor for the rest of the game. However, in production, there was supposed to be one. There was like this kind of dragon that was supposed to feel unkillable with your tools that you currently have, and that you either have to avoid it or, something along those lines. But the point is, the tutorial section is clearly not ready or polished or even that good at all. When you do finally arrive in Majula, you are greeted with some incredibly peaceful and serene views. However, and this is something I don't really hear many people talk about, I think the initial comfort Majula should provide is actually muffled by the fact that there was no giant challenge or really hard boss just beforehand. The safe comfort of Majula would have hit so much harder if you feel like you barely made it out of something like a dangerous world or had a near deadly encounter with something. It's just a weird feeling for its reveal, and although I generally like Majula structurally, and the music is so damn trendy, tranquil. I can't say that I like it more than any other version of Firelink Shrine. In Dark Souls 1, I think it works so well because it's like this safe haven built into the world, and you're going to be connecting back to it quite a lot. It's just implemented so masterfully. In Dark Souls 3, Firelink is really practical, very moody, and has lots of features and secrets close together, and it feels like it's a safe aside away from your more linear path and journey. I feel like Majula falls in that awkward middle ground where it's not built well enough into the core level design to be like integral to the world at large, and it's not tight or refined enough to live up to Firelink in Dark Souls 3. It's not bad at all, it just feels a little out of place and not polished enough to feel like this was meant for Dark Souls 2 from the very start, or otherwise, it underwent pretty severe redrafts. But what it does give you though is a starting area of choice, either going to the Forest of Giants or Heed's Tower of Flame. But after those two areas, you realize Majula isn't exactly connected to anything else other than what's in the well, which is important later, but it's also intentionally set up where they had to crank up the fall damage for this too, but more on that later. But for what it's worth, Majula does have some cool stuff, like getting the keys to unlock the mansion and other secret little areas within it, or the covenants, but I can't help but feel still that it sits in an awkward middle ground between being really connected like DS1 or being very often its own world and doing something very unique like DS3. But overall, the functions are pretty much the same, it's peaceful, and I really like everything about it otherwise. As a direct result of the troubled development we talked about earlier, they had way too many levels and maps built and had to find a way to cobble them together. Dark Souls 3 has this problem to a way less degree. Yes, it has a variety of set pieces and atmospheres that can be quite different, but the way they connect to each other at least makes sense and feels like a natural progression of your journey. However, you can tell by how much they had to slap levels together in this game, it's so disconnected, like when it comes to that aspect, it's crazy. The best example is when you go from Earthen Peak and Harvest Valley, and then going up on a lift, and then you arrive at Iron Keep that has lava on the ground. It's already a little silly, and this was not supposed to happen, and this was a mistake internally during development, but it could have at least felt a little better if they just simply made this lift go down instead of up. I don't know, it's just stuff like this where you can tell they really didn't have it together a whole lot. Also, something I find fascinating about Dark Souls 2 is the power level curve that is so much different compared to its siblings. In general, you'll beat a game like DS1 or 3, or even like Bloodborne, around level 75 to 90, give or take. That's usually where most people beat the game, somewhere in that ballpark. But because of Dark Souls 2's really inflated volume of content and different power curve, people usually finish all of DS2 at about level 130 to 150, give or take. This does a few weird things to the gameplay. Firstly, it makes each individual upgrade feel definitely less impactful, but secondly, it gives you way too much leeway to upgrade all stats instead of maxing into like one or two main ones for your build. If you play the game normally and don't really die a whole lot, or just a normal amount, you're going to have a surplus of levels where you can kind of just start throwing things around. You'll have excess souls after hitting the hard cap. Even if you're being conservative with leveling up, you'll still have way more than enough to over-level a bunch of stats. The fine-tuning is just a little off, and this is a direct result of them trying to repurpose a bunch of their content and it then doing funky things to the level powering curve. It could very well also have a lot to do with the fact that, again, ADP is like a base mechanic that is almost forced to be leveled up in this game, so you do need an excess of souls to even get to where like the base mechanic should be. So I can understand why it was made that way, but I'm not even saying that it's good. It's just a little off. But in the grand scheme of things, I can't even really say these are that big of complaints for me. They're just very minor observations, and this stuff is forgivable. What is not, however, is the level design and runs to bosses in this game. Some of these boss runbacks are downright horrendous game design and just meant to deliberately piss you off rather than feeling like a learnable but fair challenge. Some highlights of this are the runs to both Smelter Demons. Like, holy shit. I don't even know what to say about some of these, or, the run to Sir Alon, or by far the worst is the run to Lud and Zalin in the Frozen Outskirts. This is the most experimental game design stuff by far, and it's like a 5-minute run to the boss with no visibility and horses that you can't really just run past. This area is so bad, it genuinely made me reconsider how I feel about the game. I understand it's a co-op area, but still. When done right, I really see Dark Souls boss runs that are like kind of the old Mario platformers. They're built the same way, right? You have a checkpoint and a run to a boss that can be a challenge, but it was always fair and could be mastered. Then you get to the boss door and then you can learn it, right? Like they share very similar concepts. Dark Souls 2 runbacks are amateur and sloppy as hell. It's again just that attitude of, whoa, Dark Souls sure is so hard, right? Using cheap gimmicks or enemy placements to make it feel unfair. But even worse, I think that a lot of the boss runs are terrible because the actual bosses in this game aren't terribly hard for the most part. The runs to them are meant to maybe compensate for the fact that the bosses can be a bit underwhelming at times. If for some reason you like the feeling of dying while trying to engage with the actual content you paid for, then Dark Souls 2 is probably going to be your game. And let's not forget the incredibly slow lever pulling animations and the vulnerable walking through mist animation for some reason, but it's not even the boss runs only. Some of the levels are just plain sloppy and poorly made. Again, reinforcing the idea that this team didn't really quite know what the magic of Dark Souls was. While they get some major pieces right, something always just felt like a little bit out of whack when it comes to every other element of the game. But the worst thing by far in Dark Souls 2 as it relates to core combat are its wonky and jank hitboxes and terrible lock-on system. Now, I could literally talk about this stuff for hours, but I'm going to condense it a bit. Essentially, in a game like this, you want the enemy hitboxes, that is the actual part that deals damage, to match the weapon model that it's placed on, and likewise, you want hurt boxes, that is the actual player's model that can be damaged, to be accurate to what is seen. When working correctly, this system is like music and flows beautifully. It allows you to make better decisions in combat and really have a sense that you feel like you know what's going on. You can think more creatively and everything like that. For example, hurtbox shifting to avoid moves in DS3 or Elden Ring is like the sexiest thing you can do in that game. And it works because for the most part, the hit and hurt boxes are accurately placed on their models. But that is not the case here. But instead of just telling you, it's probably better I show you. And forget about the lock-on system that doesn't really work well in combat and is unpolished and doesn't even serve the function that it was built to serve anyways. All of this is to say that the unfinished nature of the combat really does a disservice to the game's enemies and bosses, which is a real shame because Dark Souls 2 actually does have some amazing bosses and other enemies and set pieces, and yes, even some level design too. Now, I've been fairly critical about it, but let me highlight a couple things I really love about Dark Souls 2. Well, you know, for starters, there's the... And also, I love the... And let's not forget about the... Okay, no, I'm just kidding. Anyway, I think the expansion of enemy and weapon build variety was excellent in this game. Now, there is a ton, just a plethora of upgrade materials in Dark Souls 2, and I understand I criticized DS1 for basically having not enough resources. DS2 maybe goes a little overboard with having too much. I think DS3 finds the good middle ground, but I still like how there's a fair amount of variety in terms of like upgrading armor or even weapons. There's a cool item in the game called Bonfire Ascetic, and this allows you to make the enemies in the area harder, as well as resetting the boss of that area as well, and putting it on its new Game Plus equivalent level, so you can run back bosses, but they'll be even harder this time, and I really like this feature a ton. I like the more options you get specifically for, you know, your character's inventory. You have more ring slots and stuff like that. The torches, you know, I can do without. I don't think it's an incredibly useful mechanic in this game, or really shouldn't be so integral, but for the most part, I like the actual character design stuff. And although the cobbled together level design does come with its drawbacks like we talked about, it does come with a few upsides, namely, it does have a ton to play. Again, there's like over 40 bosses in this game, which is an insane amount, which means you get a huge variety of not only set pieces, aesthetics, enemies, and again, yes, main bosses, which we will talk about as those are, again, probably the highlight of the game in general. Dark Souls 2 did a phenomenal job at expanding on the equipment and items in the game, and weapons and armor, and just the player systems in general from Dark Souls 1 is a real evolution of that, but unfortunately, you know, a lot of those systems can be stifled by just these terrible quality of life choices that were made, but, you know, they still improved and evolved things nevertheless. There's a couple mechanics mechanics that Scholar specifically added to the game, like the fragrant branches of yore. You'd have these statues where you can basically use this like consumable item that is a limited resource to open up a certain area. Moving a statue would typically grant you a certain new playable space or an item, whatever it is, but at the same time, I feel like this is a scuffed system because there's actually more statues in the game than there are fragrant branches. So if you're not careful, you can accidentally permanently cut yourself off from areas if you used all your branches on other stuff, and you're not really sure if the statue you're using a branch on is even worth it or not until it's done. So that's not great. Another mechanic I really just dislike is these like things that shoot out like orange smoke. I don't even really know what they're called, but they just break your equipment. They don't really do any damage to you, but they're literally meant just to shatter your stuff so that you have to be inconvenienced to go back to Majula to fix everything and then go back in. This adds nothing to the core gameplay loop and is just like a blatant interruption in gameplay. It's horrible. Also, I found the lack of emphasis on shortcuts to be really odd, to be honest. Like, because of how masterfully it was done in DS1, you have a little bit of shortcut stuff going on at the beginning of Dark Souls 2, but, you know, in the late game and especially in the DLC, there's a few here and there, but for the, like, middle chunk of the game, there really isn't much to be had in the way of shortcuts or, like, other unlockable areas that are intelligently placed that help you traverse the map, at least not in the way that it was set up in other games. It just felt like a bit of an afterthought and didn't get that much emphasis on it, which, you know, shortcuts in a couple of these places would have really helped the flow and pace, in my opinion. And while many of the areas are really striking aesthetically, I have to say in terms of their interactivity, they ring very hollow compared to what you might expect from how an area like this is laid out. I just think that a lot of the levels and the way that they come together suffer from a lack of focus, which should be no surprise because of, you know, what we know about the development of this game. So many random pieces and bosses and puzzles got cobbled together where it had really a lot of trouble coming together as one vision. Now, a certain mechanic that I both like and dislike for different reasons when it comes to bosses is like, if you played the game, you'll notice that the setup to many bosses requires you to do some kind of task beforehand, or, you know, to do it optimally. For example, like when you're fighting the Fume Knight, you got to use these, like, you know, smelter shards or whatever to break these healing pools that the Fume Knight can actually use. Or with King Vengerk, you need like to collect certain giant souls that will wear down his defenses, otherwise you're fighting a giant damage sponge. It's like you have to meet a lot of these prerequisites before you can beat the boss in a lot of cases, which in and of itself I don't hate, but sometimes it feels like you really have to go out of your way and do a bunch of chores to beat a boss that you theoretically could mechanically beat on your own. In general, I can appreciate a lot of the experimentation that Dark Souls 2 wanted to do with its game design and levels and structure and all that stuff, but in many cases, I just don't feel like it worked, and it certainly falls flat. But the thing that is a giant mixed bag as well, and is pretty much the defining feature of these games, is of course boss fights. And again, there are a ton of them, so we're going to go over all the bosses in their respective areas of the game and really get down to the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to Dark Souls 2's boss selection.
Bruh, I be trying to tell you, because we live in a video game world, bro. Half of these niggas ain't even real people, bro. Watch this. You know that, though. Bruh. That can't be a real...
So, as we stated earlier, there's no opening boss to DS2. There's not this one, like, canon fight that everybody starts with when they play a fresh game of Dark Souls 2, which is a little weird because you pretty much have two options which you can go, but you don't fight these bosses until a little bit later in the game, at least comparatively to, again, its 1 and 3 counterparts. But most new players run into the last giant first, and this is probably what they had in mind for an opening boss, and I still think, even though it's not technically a tutorial boss, it may as well be. It's incredibly slow, and it doesn't have that fast moves. It's intimidating enough to, you know, really put the hair on the chest of new players, but it's not going to oppress them. It kind of just stands there and takes damage. It doesn't even have that much health, which is fairly surprising. The arena itself is pretty standard. The route to get there is kind of interesting. You have some shortcut stuff going on, but the last giant himself, you will fight like variations of it later, but this is the most basic version of the game. But again, I kind of consider this to be the tutorial boss of the game. That and Dragon Rider, which is going to be the next boss. Dragon Rider's arena is unfortunately very exploitable, but as being an opening boss, it's just you and this one big sword and shield opponent, and it gives you the basic foundation of how to deal with these enemies. Again, it gives you a little bit of stage hazard stuff where you can fall off the arena, so can the boss, but if you're, playing it just flat out vanilla and straight, then I think this is probably the best boss, even more so than the Last Giant, of introducing the player to Dark Souls 2 mechanics and what to expect going forward. I really like Dragon Rider in and of itself. I think it's an awesome fight, but it kind of just irks me how much they reuse this damn boss over and over again. You're going to see it a lot throughout this game, and I think its first encounter on its own is the most memorable, and it does get reused as a regular enemy later in the game, which again, you know how I feel about it. That always kind of drives me insane, but it's not the most outright offensive thing in this case. Now, the next boss is the Pursuer. You can typically fight this after you beat the Last Giant, and it is an optional boss, but most people will end up fighting this. You'll also encounter the Pursuer when visiting certain areas, but in this particular encounter, you can actually cheese it by using this bow and arrow ballista thing that will essentially delete it. But playing it, straight one-on-one is actually where I find the Pursuer to be the most enjoyable. It's a very rhythmic, dance-like fight, and it's honestly an excellent one. I don't have anything bad to say about the Pursuer as a boss. It's just that you'll encounter him in plenty other areas that are not a boss encounter that are far less intimidating, but it is cool otherwise. Next up, we have Dragon Slayer Ornstein, which is not the only time that they reuse content from Dark Souls 1. This time, you don't have Smo. It's literally just Ornstein himself, and this is also an optional fight, but if you know how to fight Ornstein in that game, then you should have no problem adapting here. I know there's lore implications or whatever for why Ornstein is in the armor here and why he actually exists in Dark Souls 2, but basically I think a lot of it was also, hey, it's very easy to reuse content from Dark Souls 1 that fits in this kind of context, so I don't really outright hate his implementation here. It just feels like a little bit more shallow because being on his own, it doesn't have the same effect. I don't know. It's a fine fight, and it's a good optional boss, but it's not amazing or anything super outstanding. Next in the No Man's Wharf area is going to be the Flexile Sentry. This is a great idea for a fight, and I love their varied moveset. I think it's actually outstanding. It's one of the better fights in the game, I think, as far as concept goes and mechanical execution. I will say I dock points because they reuse this boss quite often throughout the game, which I understand their reasoning for it, but again, it takes away from that specialness and how unique they feel in their own encounters. I'm a big fan of less is more sometimes. They have two completely different movesets and threat ranges, and even have combo mix-ups using the two sides, which is hella cool. And it's, again, probably a high-tier boss in this game overall, but I just don't really love the reuse too much. But after that is going to be Ruined Sentinels. I really enjoy them, however, I can't say this fight's perfect. DS1 and 2 would do this thing a lot, where you were either forced to take damage on the route to the boss, or in the arena itself, and in this case, it's actually the arena. You spawn in with this little drop down, and basically no matter what, unless you have the ring, you're gonna take a hefty amount of damage getting down to the more open and playable area. And also, it's kind of just a big open box down here too. There's not much in the way of debris. There's a little bit, but you kind of want some more stuff to maybe weave through in and out and separate them and stuff to take them one-on-one, because it's 3 enemies and they all have very fair and reactable moves, which is fine. I actually don't have a problem with the boss design themselves whatsoever. I just think the arena doesn't complement it super well, but I still overall really enjoy this boss. Next up are the Belfry Gargoyles that are actually, yes, reused from Dark Souls 1, except this time more than 2 will spawn, and that completely changes the dynamic. Now, I haven't even talked about it, but there's a whole mechanic of Pharaoh's Lockstones, which essentially allow you to access illusory walls. In Dark Souls games prior, you either attack or roll at a certain illusory wall and it should open up, but in DS2, they make these walls actually a resource, and besides 1 or 2 in the DLC, they all have to be opened up using items, which this boss itself is accessed using one of these items. You can't kind of just walk to it if you want to. That aside, the boss itself is mechanically the Belfry Gargoyles from DS1, which again is a great fight, but them adding another third gargoyle into the mix makes it a little more sloppy. I don't think it plays quite as well as this game as it does in DS1, where it was made for those systems, made for those mechanics, and specifically that arena. It's okay in this game, but not quite as good as the original. Next up, the Lost Sinner is, I think, the first actual hard checkpoint for most players getting to this stage in the game. And it's for good reason, because you actually get the first of your primordial bonfires upon beating this boss. And it has an interesting gimmick where you can basically keep the arena dark or bright if you light the torches on either end. This boss really makes the feel and everything and the mechanics of Dark Souls 2 really shine. And there's not a lot of bosses that do that, but I think in particular the Lost Sinner goes really well with what DS2 is attempting to capture. After the Lost Sinner, unfortunately, the boss lineup begins to sag a little bit at this point in the game, and we get to Skeleton Lords. This is a very easy gank fight, and it's hardly even a boss at all. It's pretty straightforward. Like, the skeletons don't really revive themselves or anything. There isn't much, like, switch-ups going on here in terms of, you know, something you wouldn't expect. It's very, you know, by the books. What you see is what you get, and it's fine. I think most people are going to beat this first try anyways. Executioner's Chariot is next, and it's a good fight. It's just more or less a puzzle boss, but it has, unfortunately, one of the worst boss routes in the entire game, period. It's a real disservice because the boss itself, you know, once you understand the puzzle, is pretty entertaining, and it's not that hard, and it's kind of fun to do. I actually like it, but I hate, and I cannot, like, stress enough, I despise the route to this. It's so intentionally set up to be annoying, where it absolutely did not have to be. There could have been a ladder or another bonfire closer, but the route makes this one so unbearable to play. But it's a shame because the fight itself is you go in and you take out these different witch spawners that are keeping these skeletons alive. You shut this lever to make the chariot hit these bars, and then you kill it. It's like pretty easy. You do encounter the actual chariot horse later in Dringlet Castle, but that aside, it's a cool encounter in and of itself. Next up in the Harvest Valley area, we have the Covetous Demon. It's one of the easiest fights in the game, period, if not the easiest. I mean, I'm trying to think of anything else that is more simple than this. I get it's set up to be, you know, a less challenging fight for lore reasons. There's a lot of implications for that, but I get the feeling some of these bosses just don't need to be here. They're not fleshed out enough, and again, it's that quantity over quality approach where it just feels like this has been shoved in just for the sake of having a boss, not because it really needed to be here or was like a memorable moment in the game. It kind of just exists. I don't have much to say about it. It's an unremarkable boss, but it's an encounter you're gonna have in the game. In the Earthen Peak area, we have Mytha the Baneful Queen, and like visually, I think this boss fight is hella unique. I think aesthetically she looks awesome. The arena is questionable, so if you go in for the first time, you're just gonna have this poison floor that you could still technically kill her in, but obviously is gonna drain you of your health if you don't do anything about it. But then you can burn like this random steel pipe or something that will then take away the poison in the arena. It makes absolutely no sense, and clearly this was a little scuffed and slapped together too, but it's a decently memorable encounter. I don't love the gimmick, but it's fine. It's not outright offensive. It's an okay fight. I'd say it's pretty mid-tier for this game. Next up is the Red Smelter Demon, and you'll notice that I'm including red because there actually is another version of Smelter Demon in the DLC that is a blue one, and it's a little different. But the thing they do share and have in common, however, is the routes to get to both Smelter Demons are incredibly bullshit. It's such a pity because the fight itself, I really like Smelter Demon. I know not everybody enjoys this fight, but I really like it. It gets a little repetitive and rhythmic, and that's totally okay. I actually really enjoy both versions. They're slightly different, but I like them for their own reasons. I hate the route to get there, which it just feels, with Dark Souls 2 greater design, it's like the devs will do everything in their power to not allow you to even interact with the bosses. It's like they don't even want you to play with them at all. I just don't get it. But the Smelter Demon fight is really fun. You know, he's a bigger enemy with a sword, but also he has an interesting mechanic. If you get too close, the passive fire that's surrounding him can deal damage to you, so you have to actually pick your punish windows very intelligently, and also your heal opportunities intelligently as well. The main boss of this area, who also guards another primordial bonfire, is the Old Iron King, which its scenery and its atmosphere leading up to this fight are like impeccable for this game. It's so sick walking out to this like arena fire pit on your own. And the fight introduction itself is pretty damn intimidating, but the mechanics of this fight are laughable at best. They have to know deep down this fight's kinda goofy. Like, I know in my head what they were probably envisioning, where, you know, you want to feel minuscule and small and insignificant compared to this giant demon, and maybe even feel a little claustrophobic, like surrounded by the lava and all this stuff, but I don't think it really quite grabs the feeling they were going for. It's also incredibly easy for what it is. It gives me Ceaseless Discharge vibes from Dark Souls 1 without the, like, cheesable part about it, but you gotta fight it head on. But also, this is, you know, probably a one and done for most people still anyways. Now, next is gonna be the Royal Rat Vanguard. This one, again, not much to say. It spawns you a ton of rats in this room. There's one rat with, like, slightly blacker hair. Only thing you gotta do is kill that one to death, and you won. Congrats. After that, though, in the Black Gulch, we actually get a very good fight. The Rotten is another primordial bonfire, you know, guardian, and I think this one is honestly excellent for what Dark Souls 2 is, the pace of gameplay, the combat, the weapons, and everything. I think this fight was very much catered towards that kind of pace. It's not the coolest fight ever, but I think it's very solid. The only thing I don't really like in here are the arena hazards. There's like fire pits and stuff that can be a little annoying, but otherwise, I love the Rotten's entire moveset. It keeps you on your toes. There's a nice amount of mix-ups, and I think it's an excellent fight. Next up is Scorpionus Najka, and in the Shaded Woods area, this is basically, hey mom, can we have Chaos Switch Quelaag? Son, we have Chaos Switch Quelaag at home. This is basically the scuffed equivalent of that. It's a little bit less good than that fight, but it's okay. It's cool because it can become invulnerable for a little bit when it dives under the sand, and it's got a little, you know, few interesting things going on that separate it from Quelaag, but I don't think this version of the boss is as hard. The moves are a little more telegraphed and reactable. The Scorpion, I would say, is easier to dodge than you would probably expect, and it's not super threatening. It just looks cool. I think that's really about it. Next up is Royal Rat Authority, which is pretty much Sif from Dark Souls 1 with less sauce and a gimmick where rats will make you toxic in the beginning, and that's the extent of it. It's not as interesting as Sif. It doesn't have, you know, quite as much lore behind it. It doesn't even have a sword in its mouth, but it moves the same way. It has the same, like, patterns and stuff, so it's pretty recognizable, and you'll probably take it down within 1 or 2 tries. It does descend from, like, the top rope, which is cool, but other than that, I think this area is mostly for PvP anyways, so I feel like this fight is just kind of tacked on. I can't help but feel that this was added somewhat last minute. Next boss is Prowling Magnus, which is a meme gank fight. It's like not even really a boss, which is the case for a lot of these. It's a cluster of enemies. It's not that happens to have a health bar. It's not even an actual boss. You got a couple of these magic lads and a couple of these crawling boys, but they just happen to have a health bar. But realistically, it's just a room of enemies that you can't leave until you kill, not an actual boss. Next up is Duke's Dear Freya, which if you're an arachnophobia lover, then you are going to absolutely despise this boss. It looks incredibly disgusting, which is great for a boss like this. And it also kind of has the idea of the Flexile Sentry, where they pretty much have 2 different heads, and the hitboxes on this boss are incredibly stupid. I can't lie, but I like the idea of where it essentially shifts its vulnerability windows from the front to back, and you have to kind of chase it down a little bit. It's a cool fight once you get the hang of it, or once you understand how it works. Not particularly difficult, but it has a great presentation. I love the atmosphere. I love the route to get here, surprisingly enough. Having a torch in your hand makes these smaller spiders keep their distance from you, giving you better, you know, opportunities for damage on the actual giant spider. So it's a cool little fight, and I actually enjoy this one quite a bit. Next up is the Looking Glass Knight, which again has an amazing presentation, and I even really like its moveset, but its gimmick is the fact that it can spawn either an NPC into the battle arena with you, or a real player sometimes. And if it spawns a real player, there's a chance that the boss could just get healed from the other person, making this a insanely one-sided fight. I don't know if this one was quite as polished as it could be, but depending on, you know, what it spawns for you can pretty much determine your entire experience with this boss. But overall, I think I do really like it. After that, we have the Demon of Song in the Shrine of Amana area, which is one of the worst levels in the game, and not a super outstanding boss either. It's very simple. I think this thing has, like, I don't know, just a handful of moves. It's not very many, but its little gimmick is that it can pull this hood over itself and it becomes invulnerable. So you pretty much just have to wait for its startup to become vulnerable, or right before it closes up again. It's very by the books. There's not much to say about this fight, but it's cool. It's fine. Velsat the Royal Aegis is an excellent fight in DS2, but it's not the hard checkpoint that I think it could be, like the Pontiff Sullivan of Dark Souls 3, where this is like pretty much the gatekeeper into the late game sections, where it should be kind of a hard checkpoint to make sure that you are prepared for this. But this boss fight, while it is tough for some people, I don't think it's actually as threatening as maybe it could have been. Also, I love him on his own, but I hate the fact that another DLC boss can basically summon him into their their own fight, and it really makes this encounter, again, far less special. But I do enjoy it for its presentation, and the actual mechanics are pretty solid too. Guardian Dragon just looks like an unfinished and unpolished fight. It's not nearly as cool as Calamite or Midir are in their respective games. And also, once you beat Guardian Dragon in a boss, encounter like this with a health bar, you then proceed to fight a bunch of random Guardian Dragons that are just regular enemies. I don't really understand why this fight's in the game. This is another one where I'm like, do we really need to have this in here? I don't know, but not a great fight in my opinion. I really don't like this one that much. After that is Giant Lord, which is very similar to the last Giant, but this one has a weapon and it's got a slightly different moveset, and it also has a bit more of an awkward battle arena. It's a bit skinnier and narrow, and my problem with both the last Giant and the Giant Lord is the camera doesn't really work that compatible with these giant scale enemies, particularly really tall ones that you can't see the top of. You're just swinging at its feet and knees the whole time, which doesn't really have the same effect. It's a fine fight for what it is, and it's pretty easy, similarly to the last Giant. Very unremarkable otherwise, but it is a boss you need to beat to finish the game. Ancient Dragon ties Ancient Wyvern for being the worst dragon fight in Dark Souls, period. I don't think Dark Souls really knows how to get dragon fights right for the most part, especially large-scale ones like this. The arena doesn't complement the scale of this enemy, the hitboxes are incredibly jank, and it has some of the most easily exploitable dumbass AI that I have ever seen, and it's just kind of a disgrace to be in the game. And it has moves that combo into each other that absolutely should not. I think the Dark Souls series specifically has always struggled with larger enemies, but specifically dragons. I think Elden Ring did a little better with dragons, but even then they're not perfect, but they are a step up from what they did in a lot of these games. Ancient Wyvern in DS3 and then also Ancient Dragon here are just not great. Not a mandatory boss, but one I imagine most players will take on is King Vendrick, which again, this is a boss where you got to meet these prerequisites, where for each giant soul you have, its defense that it has actually gets cut in half. So if you have all the giant souls, you pretty much play it at normal HP. This fight is very good. It's slow, like the pace isn't that fast, but it's very brutal. He outputs a lot of damage and will oftentimes one-shot you depending on your armor and health setup. I would say this fight's more about positioning than it is reaction. As long as you're near like the left side of him, his sword hitbox usually can't touch you that much. So this fight becomes significantly easier just once you know where to stand. So before we get to the final game bosses of like the base game of Dark Souls 2, let's talk about the DLC, because as I mentioned, there are 3 expansions, and the first DLC boss we're going to talk about is Alana, and I think this fight is pretty good. She's pretty much a mix of everything, where she can spawn stuff. She actually plays like Nashandra, which we'll get to, and she can even spawn in Velstadt as well as like skeletons and stuff. So this fight is easily one of the most unique ones in the entire game, period. But the fact that the closest bonfire is hidden behind a random illusory wall that you would have no reason to ever check is kind of crazy. Like, but it doesn't even require Pharaoh's Lockstone. It's like a normal illusory wall. I don't know why the hell they made that choice for this specific boss run in the DLC. I genuinely couldn't tell you, but otherwise it's a fairly unique fight and is a decent way to open up the DLC. After that, we're going to talk about the Grave Robbers. Next, we're going to talk about the Grave Robbers, which again is a part of the co-op area. It's meant to be played with more than one person, but again, you can absolutely do the solo. But it's a gank fight against 3 NPC enemies. You got like a big boy Havel, you got a bow and arrow guy, and you got just like a normal sword dude, pretty much. Like, it's just the 3 archetypes, and you can play them like they're NPC bots in this game. You just got to continue to bait out moves and whiff punish them, and as long as you don't get too greedy or do anything stupid, you actually should beat this first try. This fight is literally all about patience, especially if you're doing it by yourself, but it's fine. I don't know if I would even, again, classify it as a boss fight. DS2, I think, uses the term boss fight very liberally. Next in the DLC fights is Sin the Slumbering Dragon, which is not my favorite iteration of a dragon boss. I think my favorite dragons ever are probably Midir and Calamite, and that's about it. This one has potential, but I think the hitboxes on this are super jank, like maybe some of the worst in the game. And also, it's a dragon that's not on the ground for very long. It doesn't have that many like real big openings for punishing. It's a little bit slower paced than I think it could be, and also it has that stupid smoke thing that breaks your equipment, which is just, there's no excuse for that. I think that's the most annoying mechanic in the game by far. Didn't even talk about it much earlier, but weapon durability, that becomes an actual factor here, because literally smacking this boss with your primary weapon, you you have a good chance of breaking it mid-fight, so you may need to take repair powders in and stuff, which is just so like clunky to do mid-fight. It's not, I don't know, there's no reason for it other than they're just gonna do it to you. So not my favorite fight in the game for its actual moveset. Once again though, it certainly has potential, and with a few small tweaks and a little bit more polish, I think this would actually be one of the better dragon fights that Dark Souls has ever seen. But it's a far cry when comparing it to Calamite in DS1 or Midir in Dark Souls 3. In the next DLC, the boss we have after that is actually going to be the Fume Knight, which to me, I think is probably my favorite fight period in Dark Souls 2, and maybe even the best fight in this game. I think it's excellent. It does have that somewhat strange gimmick with the smelter wedges, where I was saying earlier, it actually has these pools that will regenerate its health. You can get away with maybe not having destroyed one or two of them and still kill the boss, but if you don't want it to regenerate any HP, you actually need a bunch of smelter wedges to take out all of these. But even if you manage to meet that prerequisite, this fight is still no walk in the park. Its moveset is so incredibly varied, it's got excellent mix-ups, and it's super threatening. And I kept using bonfire ascetics to reset this boss again and again because I just couldn't get enough of it. This is Dark Souls 2 at its best. Again, not my favorite version of the Dark Souls combat system, but I think this one still works incredibly well in this game. It is easily the highlight of the DLC fights, and if it was in the base game, it would bump up the track record of these so much, but I love it. I think it's probably my favorite fight period in DS2. After that is going to be a close fight for top 3 is going to be Sir Alon, which is an excellent fight in and of itself, but it has a terrible route. With the Fume Knight, they have a bonfire pretty much right next to the arena, so you can focus on fighting the actual boss. But Sir Alon is, I wouldn't say quite as difficult as the Fume Knight, but the route to get there is so painful. The conclusion I came to with a lot of these routes, they just don't need to exist, but once you get to the fight, it's godly. The only thing I don't like on Sir Alon, he has like a kind of wonky grab hitbox, which doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, it can be incredibly annoying. But otherwise, the arena's great, the theme is insane, the moveset is perfect, the animations are excellent. I love this. I think it's almost as good as Fume Knight. They absolutely killed it with boss quality in this DLC. Actually, I think I may take that back a little bit. Something that is a blemish on the record of this DLC is the Blue Smelter Demon. Again, I told you both Smelter Demons have terrible runbacks. The route to this is a literal joke. You can go a couple of different ways. There's some shortcuts you can take, but for the most part, the enemies are set up in a way where they're just going to annoy the absolute living out of you. It's crazy. Now, assuming you haven't mauled it enough to delete the game at this point, if you make it into the fight, it's a fight you've already done, the Smelter Demon, but blue. Now, again, to be fair, the timings on its actual moves are slightly different than the original, so I guess you could say it's a different fight, but that's like saying that sparkling water and club soda are technically different liquids. That would be all the bosses as far as that DLC goes, but in the next one, I think is the weakest DLC overall. I hadn't even really talked about the DLC designs of their levels and everything. I kind of baked them into the normal game, but this is the DLC I think I was the least impressed with, and unfortunately, it also has some of the least impressive bosses in my opinion. The first one is Ava the King's Pet, which is cool. I think it's a slightly better version of the Royal Rat Authority. It's actually the fight that probably should have been, and it has this gimmick where it's invisible until you find a certain item in the level design, but it's cool otherwise once you actually fight it. I have no problem with this fight. It's kind of unremarkable, but it's somewhat fun. And then after that, we have not the worst fight in the game. It's just basically two Avas, but the route here is the infamous one where you got to go through the frozen outskirts. This is an actual embarrassing nightmare, and this is the only boss that I was I couldn't even be bothered to play this. It's not fun. If there was a bonfire right by the boss, this would be much more tolerable, but I'm not doing that 5-minute run back every single time I want to play this fight. It's not nearly a good enough fight on its own to justify a 5-minute run back that isn't even guaranteed and is quite tedious. So this one goes on the lower end for me for sure, just because of its route is actually horrendous. But after that, the final boss in this DLC is going to be the Burnt Ivory King, which again, in terms of those prerequisite mechanics, you've got to find a bunch of these knights that will fight alongside you once you enter the battlefield, because you've got to fight these other black knights that come out of the portal once you arrive. And then once the Burnt Ivory King himself comes in, that's when the knights sacrifice themselves to close the portals and everything. But this is the best fight in the DLC, which isn't saying much. It doesn't have a whole lot of competition, but it's not my favorite fight ever. I would say it's pretty mediocre in terms of the like actual overall offering. I just think that you don't get as much one-on-one time with the actual Burnt Ivory King that you could. It becomes more focused on like the giant battle between you guys, which doesn't feel as grand or, you know, narratively significant as it could. It just feels like, I don't know, a little like cutesy. I'm not sure. It just feels like kind of small scale compared to what it's supposed to be. But I love the arena. Like, that's the sickest part. But the actual king himself is not the most mechanically incredible boss, is not that remarkable otherwise. Now, there is another fight that's pretty special in this game. Like, the way you get to it is quite unlike anything else. That is going to be the Dark Lurker. Now, this, you have to get to it by first entering a certain covenant, and then you have to clear these 3 caves, and you have to light these 3 torches, and every time you want to run this fight back, it actually is going to require a humanity or a human effigy from you, and it becomes incredibly expensive and doesn't have an easy run back either. I think the fight itself is awesome. I think Dark Lurker is probably like a top 5 or maybe top 10 fight for me in DS2, but the way to get back to it is just not fun, and it's, again, incredibly expensive on your resources, which I just don't really agree with. It's tedious and doesn't really feel worth the effort required to get there. I just like, again, it's little tiny changes like this where it can make the boss experience and just the overall gameplay a lot better in this game with a few tiny tweaks. Awesome idea, however, very flubbed execution. Now, the actual last bosses in the game are going to be the Throne Watchers, which you begin at first. These are a duo. They can heal each other. They have different paces within their moveset, so you've got a faster one and a slower one. While they can be tricky, if you've beaten the DLC bosses, then these should be no problem. By comparison, they're a lot more simplistic and slow, and their moves are very telegraphed, but they are pretty much the appetizer for the final main course, or the actual last boss in the game, and that is going to be Nashandra. Now, she gets an actual A++ for presentation. I think the way she enters the arena is hella sick. It's like one of my favorite things I've seen, but her mechanics are really nothing to write home about. I would say she's even less interesting than Gwen when it comes to mechanics, and there's just not a whole lot going on here other than you can't really approach her quickly because of these curse like orbs that surround her. You can break them or you can bait her out of them, and she has like a scythe, which is pretty slow moving, but if you can deal with those 2 moves, then you're basically in the clear. Having a victory over Nashandra at the end may feel a little hollow or underwhelming, but if you have done the prerequisites, there's actually one actual final boss after Nashandra, which is Aldia, Scholar of the First Sin, which is an excellent story boss, and I would actually compare him to the Moonlight Presence in Bloodborne, where he only shows up if you do some very specific things in the game, but he's not an actual hard boss. He's pretty much just there for story reasons. Similarly, Aldia only shows up at the end after defeating Nashandra if you've done those prerequisites, and also if you've killed Vendrick before beating Nashandra. Oh no! Again, he has a very limited moveset, but that's not, I guess his fight isn't really about the mechanics as much as it is for the story and lore, and just to wrap up everything thematically. The cool thing about this fight is if you die on Nashandra, for example, you don't have to run back Throne Watchers. You can kind of pick up where you left off. So while this can be a trio like final fight where you don't really get out of the arena until you beat all 3, you can still do that because basically the last 2 aren't as hard as they probably could be, but I think they're fine. They're just not a super standout. And then after beating all of these bosses, you get your ending, which depending if you beat Aldia or not, you actually have 2 choices of how you want your ending to go. And that's how Dark Souls 2 will wrap up for most players. The thing is, the volume of the boss content is its biggest strength and its greatest weakness. I think it's cool having a Dark Souls game that has like this giant amount of content, but I think it's undeniable that many of the bosses are too repetitive to one another, or they're reused too often, or they're just not as polished as they could be if the game had fewer bosses, like Dark Souls 3 kind of went in that direction. While it's a very commonplace event for the best bosses in the game to be within the DLC packs of these Souls games, DS2 is no stranger to that either, but I just think it does suffer from having a little bit too much volume of bosses and not enough polish on them, relatively speaking. So overall, how do we sum up Dark Souls 2 and what exactly went wrong with it? I think primarily Dark Souls 2 was made to capitalize on the success of the original Dark Souls, but the creative masterminds behind the success of that game wanted to move on to a different kind of project, in this case being Bloodborne, so that the, iteration of this title more or less got left in the dust by maybe a slightly less talented team to work on a game of this nature and of this scale and magnitude and everything. And also the fact that the game had to be completely reworked in the middle of it is never a good sign. I think you can still very much enjoy everything Dark Souls 2 has to offer, as much as I do. I love so many aspects of this game, but I cannot say objectively that it's as well designed as DS1 or Dark Souls 3, or pretty much any other FromSoft game, to be honest. I can appreciate all the experimentation that went on here, but I can also say for sure that a lot of the new mechanics they wanted to try out just simply don't work, and they fell a little flat. And also the clunky feel of the controls and the actual player movement just never really gelled well with me, and is clear as day when you play any of the other games in comparison to this one. So it's a little bit more shoddily made than everything else, and it makes some very questionable decisions. That said, you can still absolutely enjoy the hell out of it if you just take it for what it is and accept the fact that it is a faulty game to some extent. As I said earlier, compared to other games in the genre that tried to emulate Dark Souls, I still think DS2 is a mile above all of those 1000%, but compared to its little family with the rest of the Dark Souls series, it is without a doubt the weakest link of the bunch, but one of them had to take the fall, and in this case, I do believe it to be Dark Souls 2.